4:31. This is a joint session to do some training on the amending a PUD and a plan unit development. Okay. And then let's stand up and do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Madam Clerk, can I get a roll call, please?
Supervisor File?
Here.
Clerk Newbeck here. Treasurer Brown?
Here.
Trustee Hayward?
Here.
Trustee Morocco?
Here.
Trustee Novoselov?
Here.
Trustee Tedder? Commissioner Billings? Here. Commissioner Borsheim?
Here.
Commissioner Lohmeyer? Here. Commissioner Lohmeyer here?
No, he's not
Okay. Commissioner Ritchie?
here.
Commissioner Scarborough?
Here.
And Commissioner Sucher?
Here.
We have a quorum.
Good, great. So at this time, I would like to go through and get approval on the agenda.
I'll make a motion to approve the agenda as presented.
Support. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Next thing is, I'd like to open it up for any public announcements. Either from the, Mr. Center? From anybody from the board, public announcements from the board? No? Anybody in the audience? I don't see you online, so we'll assume that that's not an issue. Okay? Public announcements are closed. Comments? Public comments, anybody? No? Okay. So, okay. So we're gonna go through and start this off with a presentation. And is that gonna, someone from the Carlisle group? Yeah. All right, please.
Good evening. We do have it projected in a couple different places, so I think everybody can see it, except for up here. So, all right, I suppose we're, all right. Well, good evening. I was asked to do a quick, a brief workshop, not lengthy tonight, because I know you do have special, we have a planning commission meeting, on amending a PUD, because some questions have come up, I believe, at the planning commission level about, what constitutes an amendment, why do we amend it, why do we amend it, and under what criteria do we amend it. And we have a lot of PUDs in this community that have been on the books for quite a while and have been partially developed and have come back from time to time with a new proposal that might constitute the need for an amendment. And we do have a very a specific procedure in the ordinance, and that's what I'm going to present tonight, and answer any questions that board members or planning commission members have about amending a PUD. I want to give you a little bit of background, sort of leading into the amendment process, because the amendment process really comes from the authority that of shared responsibilities with the legislative body, which is the township board. I won't read these or anything like that, but among the things that the board gets involved in are reviewing any amendments to the zoning ordinance, of which a PUD is one of those. Other items, obviously, appointments, budgets, these are all things that you know. The master plan adoption, it's an optional authority as far as the statute goes. The board has to make the decision that they will or will not choose to adopt it. These boards in this community have traditionally chosen to be the final approval body over the master plan. And we know the Planning Commission has the authority to prepare the master plan, and to prepare zoning ordinance and amendments, to do site plans and rezoning reviews. And then we have a Board of Appeals, which is your appellate body. So you're organized, similarly constitutionally. You have a legislative, you have an administrative body, which is the Planning Commission, and you have the Board of Appeals that hears variances, appeals, does interpretation, and any other duties that are assigned by ordinance by the township board. Underneath all that, you have the administrative and support staff, you have consultants that advise you, township engineer, our office, obviously Mr. Kelly's office, and that's the team that is here to help you along the way make the decisions that you have to make ultimately. We don't operate on our own. We are given these authorities through two different enabling authorities. We have the Michigan Planning Act, which was consolidated in 2008 to combine three different planning statutes that pertained to cities and villages, townships and counties. We now have a single planning act. And the same thing happened with the zoning act in 2006, so that there's uniformity in procedures. All the enabling language is the same for all types of cities or villages or townships or counties. It's been a tremendous help to get this all codified into two single acts rather than having 6 different acts dealing with different jurisdictions. It would be very confusing to clerks as well as to planning consultants who had to interpret different hearing requirements and everything. Now it's all uniform. But your ability to have a PUD provision to begin with emanates from the Township Zoning Act. And the Township Zoning Act was actually, well, I'll get into that in a minute because I'll talk a little bit about the sequence. You have 2 sort of levels of types of approvals. You have non-discretionary and you have discretionary. And the reason I put this in here is because I want you to be aware that you have a high degree of discretion over approval or even amendments of PUDs. When I say major amendments of a PUD, not necessarily minor amendments. You have non-discretionary is generally zoning administration. What the zoning ordinance says is what it says, okay? There might be interpretation or whatever, but the zoning administrator doesn't have discretion over modifying the zoning regulations other than what it says. And you have such things like site plan. If a site plan meets the standards of the ordinance, it has to be approved. That's fairly, I mean, now you have all kinds of room for judgment in that whole area to determine exactly how it meets your standards. But that's considered to be more of a non-discretionary decision. But discretion, this is why we have a planning commission and an elected township board, because you have discretion over things like special land use approval. It's up to you to determine whether it is or is not compatible in the zoning district it's located, plan unit developments. It's a rezoning. We treat it as a rezoning in this community, and I'll speak about that a little bit later. And then, amendments. So you do have discretion over whether you approve or do not approve special land use. Now, can you do it arbitrarily? No, of course not. It's got to be based on reasonable exercise of your authority and reasonably related to considerations of what's in the ordinance and public health, safety, and welfare. But you do have discretion over compatibility issues and enforcing the qualitative standards of what you expect in your community. So you do have a high degree of discretion from that standpoint. PUDs have been in effect since the early 80s. It was in early 80s when the state legislature amended the statute to allow communities to have PUDs. In other words, in many cases, it was what many communities were already doing, but they amended the statute. By the way, what was the first PUD in Independence Township?
Spring Lake?
Nope. Believe it or not,
Oh, what was it?
it's Pine Knob. Now, you had no ordinance. You had no ordinance, but you go back and you read the minutes, and they classified it as a PUD, as a special land use, as a PUD in Pine Knob. And for those members on the Open Space Committee, they were very far-sighted because they did apply, at least at that time, things like conservation easements to parts of Pine Knob that were a condition of the PUD approval they gave. Now, if you look at a zoning map of Pine Knob right now, it's all these separate zoning classifications, but it was the original PUD, not necessarily done under the statute, but it was a PUD. But, Sam, I think Spring Lake may have been the first. I know that where Mesquite Creek was, it's not called that now, it's the Fifth Tavern or whatever it is. I think that was your first non-residential PUD in the township. So, in the early 80s, we began to do, PUDs in certain circumstances. A PRD provisions in the ordinance, which is a planned residential development, is an exclusive residential classification. But it was put in the ordinance in the late 80s in anticipation of two large projects, one of which is finished and one of which is still undergoing. And the first one that's finished is Oakhurst. And the second one was Morgan Lake, which now you know as Eagle Ridge. The reason that the PRD was added is because these were both projects that at the time we anticipated were going to go on over a longer period of time. We needed to have a different process for properties of that size. The minimum area for a PRD had to be 160 acres, and the overall density could not exceed 1 unit per acre. So that's the distinction. Will you have any more PRDs in this township? Not unless somebody assembles 160 acres from that standpoint. And I don't know of any unencumbered 160 acre piece, but maybe somebody here knows. I can't think of one. Anyway, but both were designed to allow flexible application of zoning requirements based on specific plans, which in the discretion of the township and ultimately the township board met specific requirements. And, as you know, in both the PRD and the PUD, there's very specific requirements for approval, for even consideration of a project as a PUD. There's also very specific requirements for how it's ultimately arranged and designed. So that's all by ordinance. And again, I go back, the reason I showed that earlier slide, that it is a discretionary consideration on your part. I mean, you don't have to approve a PUD if you don't think it meets your standards. And Mr. Kelly might be able to tell you that, I've not seen in my career PUDs, the denial of a PUD, generally challenged from that standpoint because it is a highly discretionary form. On the other hand, most PUDs that are not acceptable never get to the point of really final approval because they just simply don't meet the standards of the community. So when I say it's a discretionary, you do have a lot of discretion in terms of whether you approve or not approve a PUD. The statute permits you to treat PUDs or PRDs as either an administrative decision or a legislative decision. So we could treat PUDs as a special land use, solely subject simply to the approval of the Planning Commission. We didn't feel in this community, or at least the framers of the ordinance and the board and the Planning Commission at the time felt that because we felt that you increase your level of discretion by it being a legislative decision, which is a rezoning. So our PUDs in this community, or PRDs, are acts of rezoning. Now, do we use the PUD statutes to do other things? We do. In Dixie Highway, we have an optional development process called the Planned Development Overlay District in the Dixie Highway. And the reason behind that was to make that a special land use subject to the discretion of the Planning Commission, because we had so many properties there that are in dire need of redevelopment, and yet to redevelop these properties, many times you'd be going to the Board of Appeals with 5 or 6 different variances. And so the idea was, is instead of sending it, ping-ponging it to the Zoning Board of Appeals, we thought the Planning Commission, to have a discretionary process where they had the final authority, they would be able to, approve plans that met more specific purposes of redevelopment of the property. We've only had, I think, one planned development, maybe two. But, you know, the project we were talking about earlier today, where the Crispellis is, was the planned development overlay. And I'm not sure that that project could have ever developed had we not had that mechanism in place. I mean, it had multiple challenges. It was a brownfield site because it was an old gas station. So, you know, that's a very specific application of the PUD statute. But, I mean, you can have, you don't, what I'm trying to say is you're not limited to having just one PUD provision in your ordinance. We've used the statute in 3 different areas for different purposes, you know, for different objectives of the township. The review process and the standards are purposely rigorous, and I know there's always disagreement about that. But the fact of the matter is, it is a rigorous process. Bill and I talk about the preliminary plans and why the Planning Commission doesn't actually approve preliminary plans, and I'll show the flow chart in a minute. It's because we want the process to be rigorous so that until you have all the details in the end with a final plan and all of the documents to support that, you're not bound to approve that. So the purpose of having a preliminary plan is to get preliminary, you know, input without binding the township to a final decision until you see all the details. So I always tell commissions with a PUD, the devil is in the details, because you are basically granting a zoning approval based on a specific plan. Now, a plan that meets your PUD ordinance and uses the basic zoning requirements underlying that, but it is a planning-based process rather than just an ordinance-based process, so that you can approve projects that you think, in your judgment, improve the community. And that's why, in this case, final approval rests with the board as a legislative decision. That's what makes it a more rigorous process than just a site plan, for example, or even a special land use for that matter. So from a standpoint, I provide this flow chart. We start with a pre-application with the township planners and others. It submits a formal application is submitted with fees. Once the application is complete, there's a review is done by your staff and consultants and any other agencies that need it. Goes to the Planning Commission for a preliminary plan. And sometimes these things don't get beyond there, or sometimes it takes a long time. But our ordinance says within 6 months after a review of a preliminary plan, a final PUD plan is submitted to the township, and other supporting materials. It's that point in time that a notice of public hearing happens, and the Planning Commission sees a final plan at the public hearing. You know, but that's after we've had subcommittee reviews, consultant reviews, staff reviews, a lot of input at that point in time. When I say subcommittee, I mean subcommittees of the Planning Commission and sometimes even township board members prior to the public hearing. The other thing that I mentioned to planning commissions is that just because you have a final plan, you're not obligated to approve that final plan the first time you see it. You have plenty of ability for input on that plan, and you postpone action until you're comfortable making an approval of a recommendation, your recommendation to the township board. And then the township board approves the first and second reading, and it's either approval, a denial, or a postponement. And accompanying that final PUD is a very important document. It's a set of PUD documents, which in essence, the PUD permit conditions are in essence a mini zoning ordinance specific to that project. So it lays out all the written conditions and requirements, some of which are shown on the site plan, and some of which need explanations, like when are certain utilities extended, for example. When is a road improvements required? And it's very detailed and spelled out in our PUD documents. These have proven to be a huge benefit in so many cases to have this stuff digested down to writing with the help of the township attorney's office, because we've had so many projects because of economic reasons and other reasons that just have gone on for a long time. The Liberty PUD, which is sort of at the south end of the Sashabaw corridor, was started in 1991. And it's still not completely built out. There's still a vacant property there that is not complete. But the guiding document to us that entire time has been the PUD permit conditions. And we've applied them, you know, when the MSU Credit Union came in, we applied those standards that guided the planning commission and the board in terms of that final approval. I won't go through the PRD flow chart because it's the same process, okay? And the only active PRD right now is Eagle Ridge and Morgan Lake. We are now in the third and fourth final phases of a project that started literally in, I think, 1989. And so this property, and a lot has happened there. But again, those permit conditions have been the guiding principles behind what you today are seeing in the site plans that are being submitted. Now, as market conditions change and things like that, people come back and they amend those plans, and that's what we're gonna talk about, finally.
Question,
Yeah,
is the written report, is that, do our minutes of the meeting constitute the
Yes.
written report?
yeah. So, so we did find out, and this actually did not exist in the original ordinance, because when we had the original ordinance, we didn't have any plans that came up for amendment. We soon found that, you know, it's kind of confusing what to do if you want to change a PUD plan. So we wrote provisions in the ordinance regarding, you know, a PUD, what happens when you amend a PUD. So we know that over time, you have things that occur that you might find out even after you are in construction. Site conditions or things like that that might have to change some kind of layout decisions or minor layout and things like that. We also have major things such as the economy, where all of a sudden, you know, there's no market for a component of what you were proposing in that PUD. And believe me, that's more common than you think from that standpoint. But when you have things going on over a substantial period of time, and look at how many downturns we've had in the economy in the last, you know, 40 years since we approved the PUD map. We've had at least 3 that I remember. You know, I was in business, so I remember going through those. We had COVID. We've had all kinds of circumstances that occurred. We have an aging population, so housing trends have changed. So we have, you know, 2, you know, approaches to this, a major amendment and a minor amendment there to handle those kinds of circumstances. So a major amendment, and both of these come before the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission makes a determination based on some, you know, recommendations from our office and from Brian about whether something constitutes a major or minor amendment. It is ultimately the decision of the Planning Commission to make that call. So a major amendment, these are considered to be substantial changes in a plan. Changes in the concept of the development. In other words, they're really changing what they're, you know, completely what they're proposing to do. Changes in the use or the character of the development. Changes in the type of dwelling as identified on the approved plan. Increase in the number of dwelling units. In other words, if they want to change the density. Okay, increase in the non-residential floor area. In other words, if it was a mixed-use PUD and they had like commercial in there, they want to enlarge the amount of floor area of the PUD, a component of it, 5%. There's a specific criteria there. Any rearrangement in lots, blocks, or building tracts, change of character and the function of any street, reduction in land area set aside for common open space, or increase in building height. So these are all pretty specific, and they all constitute a relatively substantial change. Yeah.
The increase of 5% in non-residential floor area, would that be of like a single building in a multiple building, or is it the total of all of the non-residential floor space? in the PUD.
Yeah, we had the total of all the non-residential floor space. So in other words, if there's 100,000 square feet and they want to increase it to 125, that's an increase greater than 5%, that's
Okay,
25%.
and it could be
Yeah.
a little bit here, a little
Could
bit
be,
there. for
yeah,
all
could
in
be a
one
number,
building.
yes,
Yeah.
correct.
Gotcha.
So, when this occurs, and it hasn't occurred all that much, but it has occurred on a number of our PUDs, planning commission has to weigh specifically what's being proposed and make a determination as to whether it's a major or minor amendment. And that is a call of the planning commission. A minor amendment is a change in residential floor area, an increase in non-residential floor area of less than 5%, minor variations in layout which do not constitute major changes, or a change in the phasing of the development. And this has probably been one of the more common things that we've seen, or variations in layout. The street has to change its location. They have to move a building because, in their construction review, construction plans, they realize that there's a drainage problem or there's a grade issue and they've got to move these buildings. But again, the process goes before the planning commission, and the planning commission is the one that makes that determination. Now, if it turns out, I think that's fine, if it is a major amendment, that is essentially a redo of the original approval process. Goes before the planning commission reviews the plans, planning commission has a public hearing on it, makes a recommendation to the township board. The township board reviews that major change, and either gives it approval, disapproval, or postpones it. And many times, the whole permit conditions, well, always the permit conditions have to be amended also. So that is essentially going back through the original process as if it almost is a new PUD. Many times, a lot of the reasons behind approval of the original PUD still apply. So it's not, there's not this sort of burden of reproving everything that's already was approved. But basically, it is a process that does require public hearing and ultimately township board approval. Minor amendment does not, because it's relatively minor. Might be moving a sign or changing a residential floor plan slightly, increasing or increasing floor area of a non-residential portion of less than 5%. And those are all handled by the planning commission, and then, recommendation of that to the township board. It doesn't require a public hearing, is what I'm trying to say, or a complete redo of the PUD. So that really, in essence, is how you amend a PUD. And, yes, John?
So in a PUD or a PRD that does not require a major, they do not, the planning commission or the board of trustees, they don't have the authority to impose new restrictions or variants on there, not variants, but new restrictions on it, right? I mean, even if we have subsequently changed the ordinance, we can't mandate the update to it, right? We're obliged to be held to the original.
You could certainly apply new conditions to what they are asking for to amend, what they're asking to amend. You definitely can apply new conditions for that amendment portion. If, for example, you've already approved components of their project and in fact have been built, no. I mean, it'd be pretty difficult to change those permit conditions for something that they've already committed to and have already, done all their engineering and everything else. But if that amendment has any impact upon that, I think you can add conditions. Again, conditions are always based on what is reasonable, and if there's a reasonable relationship to protection of public health, safety, and welfare, then I think you can amend conditions if they're relevant.
Can you just, one follow-up question, I'll let you answer. So let's say we go through and let's say it's a minor, and we decide that one of the board or commission decides they would like to have this, whatever this is on the amendment. Can they go beyond the, whatever they're trying to amend and say, we also want you to include this, which is not related to the?
I would not recommend that.
Okay.
No. primarily because there's no relationship to what you previously approved. And it's just, you know, I mean, on the other hand, I mean, you can always ask for anything.
Oh, that leads into my question.
Of course you can. But
So-
if, you know, if indeed it's not specifically tied to the project you already, or elements of the project you already approved, it's a pretty tough thing to do, but you can always ask.
So since a PRD is also the same, where it has to be initiated by the petitioner, not by the township to do a PUD?
Both, yes.
We can also offer that, or they need to ask us for? I was always understanding that they need to ask for the PUD.
Not necessarily, no. No, it's a little bit different than a conditional rezoning, Sam.
Okay,
A conditional rezoning statutorily says they have to offer it by statute. A PUD, we recommend regularly to somebody, I'm not just saying here, that, well, maybe because of the nature of your project, and especially ones that may require multiple variances, even though it might be a good project, we can certainly say, I think PUD is a better course of action for you. So, yeah, you can.
and then do we have the ability to recommend permit condition changes once it's been established, or how
If-
does the planning commission recommend permit condition changes? Do they recommend them to the township board, and then the
Yes.
township board accept?
Well,
what-
generally the permit conditions flow from the planning commission's review, our review, the engineer, a lot of times engineers review too, quite frequently. And if there's a condition of your approval that you think should be reflected in the permit conditions, absolutely you can recommend that.
To the board.
To the board,
To the board.
absolutely you can.
But just by making those a condition of the approval,
Yes.
I mean, planning commission is recommending approval of the site plan as presented, possibly with the following additional conditions.
Correct.
So any changes are either reflected in the site plan or reflected in the conditions that we cite.
Correct.
So by doing that, we are, without coming right out and saying it, we are saying we want the permit conditions changed.
Yeah.
So we don't need to say,
Oh, no.
subject to permit
Not
conditions
necessarily,
changing
no.
as follows.
Yeah, and, no, not necessarily, I mean, and the only, I guess the area that I could think of which might not necessarily be reflected on the plan itself is maybe timing and phasing of certain things. That's the only thing, like utilities, or, I'm really hard, I'm struggling to come up with a good example. But most of what, I mean, you know, what you ultimately approve, recommend for approval as a planning commission is what strongly influences and guides what's in the permit conditions. I mean, setbacks, you know, density, building sizes, all of that stuff. That's the heavy, the planning commission does the heavy lifting on all that stuff and passes that package on to the township board. So,
If we were to make, if planning commission made recommendations on recommended permit condition changes to the township board, then the township board has the ability to pick and choose which ones they should be.
they are the ultimate authority, yes, in this case, yes. And add your own, too.
From the board. We could
Yeah, add
more.
your own.
Okay.
So, I mean, I get all this on the new PUDs or PRDs, but on existing ones, that's, everything you're saying there is not exactly accurate, right? I mean, we can't go back and make conditions on the permitting if it's an existing PRD or PUD.
Yeah, it has to be, there has to be some reasonable relationship why you're doing that.
It's
There
got
has
to
to
be
be some,
associated with the
it has to be
change.
associated with why they're, it has to be associated with the change that they're asking for that may affect the permit conditions you already approved, yes. I can't think of an example where that might have happened, but I would say that it really has to have bear some relationship to the amendment that they are asking for you know, even though it might reflect something that's in the permit conditions that relates to other parts of the development. If that triggers the need for a change in the permit conditions to everything else, let's say, for example, what they're asking for puts an additional load on the utility system, and Mr. McKee is asking for a looping of the water line, yes, that's a fair condition to be added, because it's new information, you know?
Is there a time limit?
Did that answer your question? I mean, it's
Yeah,
not.
so, I mean, we can't go back and rewrite history, right?
No,
Right,
no.
okay. So I think that, yes, I think once it's established, we're pretty much dealing with the cards that were dealt, unless the applicant comes forth and asks for a variance on something from the original PUD, PRD, and there's a causal relationship to something that we feel today associated to that requested change, then it's fair game.
Yes.
But if they don't ask for it, we can't suddenly say, well, because you're over here asking for something, we would like you to change this. We can't do that. Or we can ask, but
Well,
then they can, ultimately they can say no.
If you're ever in question, here's the guy that you come to, because those are the things that he will ultimately have to defend you if, if it's a problem. So, it never hurts to ask your township attorney or your consultants or whoever, that's recommending something to you. It never hurts to ask.
By way of example, across the street,
Yeah.
we just approved, well, it's not, I don't know if the board's approved it yet, but it's a new phase, or the final phase of the
Yeah.
commercial. If they wanted to change the size of the building,
Yes.
let's say make them bigger,
Yep.
and let's say it was gonna be pushed closer to the property line,
Right.
we could have required enhanced screening,
Yes.
but we couldn't require enhanced screening on the west side of the residential
Yeah.
development.
Right.
Because it's
That's a really good example,
Okay.
and that's exactly what you did. You asked for additional screening on the portion of the property for which they were responsible, and, that was fine. That's a fair approach to that. But you're right, you can't ask them to do something, especially on property they don't control.
You can't mandate it, but you can ask.
You can ask, you can always ask. But, if they can't do it, or they won't do it, and it's not there's no reasonable relationship between what they're asking for and what you're telling them you'd like them to do, then you have an issue.
So where's the line on, we have conceptual PUD approval, like, or not,
You have a preliminary review.
preliminary review. So,
Correct.
this is gonna be commercial, this, we have
Yeah.
a buffering, whatever.
Right.
Now they come in with the final
Right.
plan of, let's say cross street phase 5, or phase
Yep.
4, whatever it is. How much latitude do we have in the amenities, the buffering, the screening? Because none of that was really detailed. There was, you get this much square footage, you get this many units, but what about how far can we go with the details?
You can go as far as what is reasonable. I mean, first of all,
And what if that has an effect on if they then struggle to achieve the density or or the square footage of the commercial or whatever, because we've dialed in these final details, and the struggle becomes,
well.
there's a struggle for them, like how does that get?
Well, I'm just saying, if indeed, and I've seen this happen, I mean, they go through this entire process and everybody's fine with the size of the buildings and all that kind of stuff. I think you have the final discretion there, Sam, to do that. You do.
Okay, so this is an
You do have the final
example,
discretion.
that we
Could I
want
tell
more
you- Could I
buffering,
tell you,
so it affects your
Mr.
parking.
Kelly, and I tell you, he would be the one to tell you whether you'd be challenged about that. That's a question. But the fact of the matter is, this is why I make the point that just because, I don't, you can decide what you want to do, but that's why in the ordinance, we don't have an actual preliminary plan approval, because you don't have all the details. And when the details become more clear to you with all this landscaping, the utilities, the stormwater, the building design. You don't see building designs at that point. You really don't have all the information until the final plan is approved. And it's not unfair to modify the project at that point, because at that point, they haven't put a shovel in the ground.
Right.
You
So,
agree with that, Dan?
Yeah.
so as a hypothetical, we approve a project, it's so much square
So-
footage, it's gonna be a restaurant, let's say.
Yeah.
It needs a certain amount of parking.
Right.
But because we're conscious of the neighboring property and we want a bigger buffer, we want this, now they lost 3 spaces. Now,
Yeah.
is that unfair for us to say, well, then you need to lose 2 tables
Yeah.
inside?
No,
to meet
not
a-
at
you know,
all.
or you need to,
No.
you know, change your
No,
plan?
or, you know, Sam, between the preliminary, where they're just looking at an envelope for a restaurant, and the final, you now know that they're gonna have a high-traffic, high-concept type of restaurant, and maybe they don't have enough parking from what you saw before. You know, you were just looking at a little bit. So, yes, I don't think that, you know, you have that discretion.
But there's also gotta be a reasonableness to
It
it.
has to be reasonable.
You can't say, I want a 100-foot heavily wooded buffer zone.
No. I mean, you have, when you started out saying 50 foot is fine, and unless there's a relationship between what they're doing and the effectiveness of that buffer, you wouldn't be on firm ground. But if there's a reasonable relationship between what they're asking to do and the offset of the impact, you have that discretion. That's why we build this into it like this, and that's why I'm saying it is a rigorous process, and that's why it ultimately comes to the township board.
Another question? The permit conditions,
Yeah,
from the few I've read in the township here, they don't list a lot of specific conditions. I don't see that in them. To me, what I see is it references by referencing the site plan.
that's correct.
So if you're looking up picking up a permit condition, expecting to read it, you're not gonna see all the conditions. You've got to study the site plan.
Well, yeah, sometimes, I mean, this is part of the drafting, you know, technique that township attorneys, you know, will some have, you know, one, you know, approach and others have other. But, I mean, if the site plan has sufficient detail and information on it,
Yes,
you don't need to list the setback requirements, because it's already on the site plan.
agreed.
But where, you know, there are other circumstances where, I will tell you that the permit conditions for Oakhurst, I mean, that's like a little book.
Is it?
Yeah. Because they had all these different building types and building envelopes. I mean, and there had to be a lot of detail in those set of permit conditions. Because, you know, what was the building official supposed to be looking at? Unless they knew that there was this flexibility that was built in, spelled out in the permit conditions.
Did this get recorded
Yes,
at the register of deeds?
yes. Yes. So it's, you know, it's been an evolutionary process. I can't tell you that we haven't learned, and township attorneys, you know, working together, that we haven't learned things that we could perfect over time. But I think this whole idea of having established this process where, you know, the rigor of the process is important. And, you know, it's always fair game. I mean, mend the ordinance if the standards aren't what you think they should be. But the rigor of the process is still, the ultimate discretion rests with the township to either approve or not approve a PUD, provided you have solid reasons for it. And once it is approved, both that plan and those written permit conditions have been an invaluable tool over time to enforce, you know, what the intent of the township was.
Is there a review like if the planning commission wants to put some, implement some policy or some changes to a plan as it gets to the final stages and then it goes to the township board, is there a review process of whether or not, what they would be asking for would be defendable, or this one item might be going a little bit far before it gets to the planning commission, you know, is that, but I understand he would be the guy, but we would ask him to do that, or is that part of
Well,
Because it doesn't happen often, but when that does happen.
I hope you're never gonna, I mean, here's the thing, Sam, because of the participatory nature that we do these things with people like, you and planning commissioners and the board members, I mean, if hopefully, what will happen in the review process, if you're going too far, we'll be able to do that. But, I mean, if you're ever, again, if you're ever concerned about that, if legally, I mean, we're either gonna bring it up, or we're gonna, ask Mr. Kelly.
So the smart thing to do, if we thought we were pushing the envelope too far, to postpone it, get some consultation, then come back, opposed to sending it to the board, and then them being consulted and having them
Always.
shoot it down or
Totally.
Whatever.
Absolutely. It's always better.
That's why there's no
postpone a
rush to
decision
get
than
them
make a
done.
bad decision.
Okay.
Can you explain two things, I have two questions for you. The expiration process of PUDs, and then the requirement that, I forget exactly how it's worded, but something to the effect that the project be under one control.
Yeah. Great questions, both of those. The expiration process, it's, the township is under, if a project expires, the township is under no obligation to initiate a rezoning of that property. And when I have been asked, when a project is expired and it's zoned PUD, you're in ultimate control. Because whatever happens with that property they, no matter what, they have to come back to you. So there's no real downside in having that property remain zoned PUD. Now, if they've improved, if they started a project and they haven't completed it, why we have the permit conditions that basically say that each portion of the project must be on a standalone basis from the standpoint of infrastructure and utilities, that is a protection for the township, that project, you're not obligated to come in and make improvements because the developer would belly up or whatever. So it would have to be up to you if you want to decide, this PUD has never gone forward, should we just rezone it to something else? But I think partly what I'm saying is, McLaren PUD, it's expired. It has been for 5 years. And we have brought it to their attention 3, 4 times, and it's expired. So there's not necessarily an upside to rezoning that property, because what do you rezone it to, I mean, you've got control over what it's going to be as a PUD. But that's just my opinion,
So we could go in and rezone that right now?
You could.
They could fight it, of course.
Of course.
If they came back to us next week and said, okay, we got a project for it, we want to complete it, are we, because it's expired, are we starting from scratch? Don't have to pay attention to the existing PUD agreement that's in place?
I hate to answer questions it depends on, but it depends on what they are proposing, I mean, if they're proposing something that was originally approved, first of all, if it's expired, you have to do something. So you would have to amend the PUD to extend the approval, and we did that with them several times. You would have to make the decision versus what they are proposing, whether that would be a major or minor amendment. But they really don't have permit conditions. I mean, there are permit conditions, but their project has expired. So I think you can make that, depending on what they were proposing, I think you can make that decision. It's, you are, the township is in complete control over the decision-making
I
process.
need to be more specific. If their request complies with the permit conditions as originally drafted.
You'd still have to make some kind of amendment. It would either have to be a major or minor
But could
amendment.
we change those permit conditions?
The township. Can the township?
Come on, Dan, help me out here.
Yeah, so everything that Dick has said, I agree with. The only thing that I would maybe put in, I don't wanna talk about a specific piece of property, is this whole idea of what's reasonable,
Yeah.
which is true, and whether or not there's the subjectiveness of whether or not it's related to, the request that they're making the developers. And what we as lawyers go back to is what we started this with, which is the Enabling Act, the Planning Act, and what is a township's authority to regulate zoning, right? Health and safety and the welfare of our citizens, it's obviously, everybody agrees. There's aesthetics, and some degree of aesthetics. So if our decision-making is to be reasonable, it has to be justified on those statutory standards. That's what we'll look at as lawyers.
Okay.
And that helps you decide, am I being reasonable? Is it related to what they're requesting? It's gotta be a governmental interest, a legitimate governmental interest. Does that help?
And things like traffic, for example,
Yes,
are
no
fair.
question, that
It's a
is
fair
a
game.
legitimate governmental interest.
Basic.
Size and density.
Yeah, public
Okay.
services, I mean, if traffic conditions change to the point that they need to do another traffic study, for example. So no, I don't think there's anything about that. As long as you have, as Dan says, it's a reasonable relationship to your legitimate governmental authority, and it's based on the protection of public health, safety, and welfare, and that's clear, then yes, the answer to that is yes. You certainly can. That's true.
Carbon control.
So let's flip it on the other side.
Okay.
Sorry, did you?
Well, the
Unified control.
unified control, I mean, and that's always a debate.
Yeah, they create, shell corporations to get around.
But, you have corporate control. You also have in the permit conditions, the successor and assigns. So to some degree, to a great degree, those permit conditions are the unified control. They are a document that regardless of who, is developing that property, they are bound by that agreement.
They run with the land.
They run with the land.
So it's not talking about, necessarily talking about an entity.
Some people interpret it that way, but I don't believe, I believe, in the dynamics of property development, very rarely with a big project, do you see one person develop that property from beginning to end. I mean, it gets state renamed partners, they do the components, they are still ultimately on the documents.
Right. And so and the reason why unified control is so important is when it gets out of sync, right? So you have a residential, a commercial, and a multifamily. And all of a sudden they go lickety-split with the multifamily, it gets done. And then the commercial, which may have been what we really thought was the public benefit, lags behind, if not goes bankrupt. And I've had that happen. So now you have this big multifamily, what are you gonna do with the rest of the pieces? That's why we want unified control, because the corporation that's doing the commercial, these are just shell corporations, and they go belly up in a heartbeat if the plan that they had. So then they essentially have to come back here, and we're almost forced to relook at it, because whatever that development was, that commercial development, obviously it's not financially viable anymore. And that's why we try to stay away from that. It's probably not, it's inevitable, it's going to happen sometimes, particularly when but that's what unified control is trying to protect us against.
Thank you.
So, from an applicant standpoint, they come in, they deal with the planning commission either gives them a what do you call it, not a verdict, but a what? Well, or denial, right? So they give approval or denial. If they want, or they can just table it. But in any case, the applicant can force a approval or denial, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And in which case, then it would go to the board.
Correct.
At that point in time, the board can approve or deny. If they don't like it, then they can go to the ZBA?
Now,
No, or are they just done at the board?
technically, they can request a use variance or,
Yeah.
but I mean, it's not, generally, a rezoning is not appealable in and of itself to the zoning board of appeals.
Right.
they have a mechanism where they could come back, request a use variance, but
When that's, right, when it applies.
it's pretty rare.
Who would they make the request to?
Well, they apply in the building with Brian, and it would go to the zoning board of appeals.
That would go, that would come before the planning commission?
No. No, once it's been denied by you, and they are appealing, it would be a very convoluted thing that they would have to do, but it did happen, that's what actually was a no-bite
I've got
case.
one right now, fine.
That was a no-bite case, wasn't it?
Yeah,
It was
yeah,
a
it was.
PUD.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, so, yeah, but they'd be going to the Board of Appeals under a whole separate procedure of a use variance, where they have to provide evidence of a hardship. And a use variance is different than a dimensional variance. Dimensional variance requires a simple majority vote. A use variance requires a supermajority. It would require 4/5 vote of your Board of Appeals. Pretty unlikely. But sometimes they do that just to exhaust all their administrative remedies before they go to court.
Don't they have to do that? Exhaust their
Well,
administrative?
where is this?
Not a use variance. They do it because it establishes two different grounds to appeal them. And I think we had it on this property
We
way
did.
back when.
We had it
Yeah.
across the street.
15 years ago. And so Dick is right, a lot of times the developers, because it's very easy to go to the ZBA, get denied, and then get to the circuit court, and you have a very quick review at the circuit court, as opposed to getting bogged down in the whole, should a PUD be reasonable and not reasonable, discovery and everything else. So the ZBA, although that standard is very high, a use variance, supermajority, it's quicker for the developers to get there on a use variance. So they often will do both simultaneously.
Follow up on Chuck's question. I thought I heard you say, and I want to clarify, if the planning commission does not recommend approval to the board, can the applicant still insist it goes to the board?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they have their right of final approval, final hearing before the board.
And they cannot, indefinitely table it. The PC cannot indefinitely table it. Yeah, right.
Has it ever happened?
Indefinitely, definitely table something?
No, when the planning commission said, no, we don't recommend something, and then they sidestep, go to the trustees, and then the board votes yes.
Well, I know when the opposite has happened.
Well,
It's just happened.
yeah, I think we're all familiar with that.
I'd have to go back and think, Jason. I don't recall.
Not off the top of your head.
No, I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know of some instances where the planning commission denied a PUD and it went on to the board and got approved. I don't think that's the case.
Anything else?
Okay,
It's very helpful, Dick.
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, let's go, does any other board members have any other comments? Nope. And can I get a motion to adjourn? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? No. Motion carried, meeting closed. Thank you, everybody.